Right now, countries all over the world are urbanizing at an unprecedented rate, pushing healthcare and social systems to the breaking points. Nowhere is this more evident than in the housing sector. Virtually every major city is facing its own version of a housing crisis, and Canada is no different. With some of the highest housing prices in the world, the cost of a single detached home in Toronto exceeds what most people will earn in 20 years. Something has to change here. So, what would be the solution? An unlikely contender out in the prairies. Enter Edmonton, a city that's still touted as one of the last affordable havens in the country. Could Edmonton hold the keys to solving Canada's housing crisis? Some of its housing strategies are seen as innovative by some. Edmonton may be seen as a leader in North America, but they're not without controversy. While some of these praises are being approached as forward-thinking and visionary, others criticize them as a policy that's being rushed in that will irreparably change their neighborhoods for the worst. Maybe some would even go far as suggesting that these changes are part of a larger agenda. We are going to explore all the bold moves Edmonton is making in urban development, delve into debates surrounding them, and see how they might just be a blueprint for a more sustainable future. What lessons can the rest of the country learn from Edmonton's approach? What controversies and criticism have arisen in response to Edmonton's new urban development strategies? What is happening here? Hey, what's up? We should know each other a little bit by now. We're on episode number 4. We're moving. And this is just another episode of what is happening here, where we break down all the stories and secrets behind urban planning and bring it to your forefront and uncover these narratives shaping our evolving cities. Today, we're tackling a topic that's actually sparked a lot of debate and discussion in cities around the world. And I think it's just going to keep coming up more and more, and that is densification. It's a really hotly debated topic here in Edmonton, and I think it'll be a hotly debated topic regardless anywhere in the world, because as people actually start feeling the impacts of densification in their own neighborhoods and seeing it actually play out, I think there's going to be a lot of tension around that. And so I really want to take the opportunity to break it down, by doing my typical research, speaking to people in the community, speaking to different urban planning people and people that work in that space to understand where everything's coming from. Just really give you that insider perspective that you may not have, because you may not have the time to really go into this and break all of this down. I do. So I'm just going to do it there for you. As the housing crisis grips this nation, it's becoming more and more clear that we need housing and we need it fast. The Canadian Mortgage and Housing Corporation reports that 3.5 million more homes are needed by 2030 to restore housing affordability. It is important that we build these homes, but where these homes are built is just as important. The way things have gone has just not been working. Where we decide to put these homes will be critical to determining whether our cities will thrive or crumble over the next several decades. The demand for homes in Canada is inevitable because this country is growing fast. It's actually the fastest growing country in the G7, and Edmonton is the 5th fastest growing city in Canada. The city of Edmonton predicts that the population will double to 2 million by 2040. That is just 16 years away. Managing this population increase has been and will continue to be one of the biggest challenges of our time. Our social systems like healthcare is already being pushed to the limit. While the solutions for these problems are outside the scope of this video, one thing is abundantly clear. We need these new Canadians. Increasing the population is a challenge, yes, but it's also a fantastic opportunity for growth in our cities. Welcoming the world's best talent is as Canadian as maple syrup and hockey, and I admit, I am biased as an immigrant myself, but these just aren't platitudes. This is a population pyramid, which shows this age and sex distribution of an entire population. And this is the one for Canada. The bulge here represents baby boomers, and as they retire, they rely more and more on the financial contributions of the current working age population to support Canada's pension plan, or CPP. As you can see, there aren't as many people behind them due to falling birth rates. This means fewer people will have to contribute even more to CPP. This could ultimately almost lead to a collapse. Countries around the world are already feeling the pinch. For example, the protests in France were in response to raising the retirement age to ease the burden on the pension system. Our fate can be much worse if we take these new Canadians for granted. And this is with current immigration. If we didn't have any immigration, this chart would look way worse. You can even see right now. Right now, we currently do not have enough people to support the amount of people that are going to retirement. This is just one example of why we need these new Canadians more than ever. It's not like these immigrants are always going to be around. By 2100 or 2100, the UN predicts a global population decline. That means if issues persist, like diploma mills producing poorly educated students, poor job opportunities, the housing and cost of living crisis, more and more immigrants may choose not to make Canada their home. So how can we accommodate this population surge without compromising the livability of our cities? One thing is for sure, we cannot keep doing things the way we did. That's what got us in this mess in the first place. The way our cities were developed here in the US and Canada was through a process called urban sprawl, which is the uncontrolled expansion of cities into rural surrounding land. This type of development is known for its low density residential and commercial properties. And these properties are typically in separate areas. So for example, you wouldn't see like a laundromat right next to where people live. Typically that will kind of be in a strip mall, for example. Urban sprawl didn't just happen. It's a result of rules and standards that determine how cities are built, known as zoning bylaws. Please don't fall asleep on me. I'll try my best to make this interesting. These bylaws dictate what kind of buildings can be constructed and where they could go. They don't decide who can live where, but rather how buildings can be used. For instance, they ensure a liquor store isn't right next to a daycare. They set limits on how high a fence can be or how far a building needs to be from the sidewalk. And it's the reason why you can't just build a nightclub in your basement. Our cities look and feel the way they do because zoning bylaws made urban sprawl the only legal way to build homes, which means that the only type of home that was allowed to be built was single detached homes. To truly understand the push for densification, we need to look at the history of the single detached homes in Canada and what they represent culturally. For decades, the single detached home has been the cornerstone of Canadian living. It symbolizes the quintessential dream of home ownership, a house with a yard and a driveway, and the promise of space and privacy. This ideal became especially prominent in the post-World War II era, when returning soldiers and their families fueled a housing boom. The government has always intervened in the housing market, and this time was no different. To provide for these new families, the government promoted suburban living through policies and incentives that made it affordable and desirable. Mortgage assistance programs made financing homes more accessible. Before this, only the wealthy could afford to buy homes, as lenders were reluctant to take the risk of lending to the middle class. The government provided lenders and banks with insurance, allowing them to take on more risks and favorable housing terms, such as 5% down payments with 25-year mortgages. Could you imagine 50% for a down payment, and on top of that, you only got like 10 years to pay off the loan? Man, things were different back then. The CMHC, the organization that we mentioned earlier, also had pre-approved housing designs for single detached homes, making them easier to build. Unfortunately, they didn't offer support for high density housing, which had negative connotations at the time that often persisted today. Apartments were seen as like slums or for the poor and the impoverished. They were stigmatized. If you lived in an apartment building, you were seen as somebody that could be seen as unsightly. I'm not saying that people think that right now necessarily, but I'm saying some of those stigmas or remnants from that still exist, especially from people that don't live downtown or don't go downtown regularly or don't associate or go to areas that have high density housing. They'll automatically think that if you lived downtown or if you live in high density housing that isn't like luxurious, then automatically there may be some level of social disorder, which isn't typically true, but it's just an example of how old stories or narratives that we tell ourselves decades ago can still impact the way that we see things today. I think that's a bigger thing, is that people's preferences were reflected in the zoning policies at the time. People didn't like apartments, so they kind of made building apartments illegal outside of a very specific area. Suburbs sprouted up around cities, offering what seemed like the perfect blend of urban proximity and rural tranquility. These neighborhoods promised a higher quality of life and a strong sense of community. However, after several decades, more and more of these people started to realize that this no longer was the case. Single detached homes and urban sprawl have led to significant problems. Take Nolensville, a town in Tennessee, for example. At first glance, this place looks like any other suburb. However, a study in Nolensville revealed that all these suburban developments were financially unsustainable. The property taxes did not cover the cost of the infrastructure that they required. In contrast, a development of townhomes in the area actually generated a profit. This demonstrates the simple fact that building suburban sprawl is financially unstable. I'm not the only one that thinks this way. Ashley Salvador, who is a city councilor here in the city of Edmonton, also had similar thoughts when it came to the cost of urban sprawl on the city. And she said this.
Edmonton has a massive infrastructure deficit. So because we have a history of sprawling outwards and growing in a really quick and rapid fashion, that means we have built so much infrastructure and amenities that we actually can't afford to sustain them and maintain them. And that current gap is $470 million annually. So the gap between our ideal renewal and what we're actually able to allocate towards renewal. And when you start unpacking that and telling that story, you start to realize, oh, that rec center that I really love in my community, in my mature neighborhood, like, we can't even afford to sustain that. And that starts to shift people's thinking, because then they start to feel the real life implications of our patterns of growth. And it translates into interesting conversations about trade-offs. Because again, some people will express discomfort with seeing more density in their neighborhoods, but the trade-off is if we don't do that, and if we continue growing in ways that are amplifying that infrastructure deficit, we might be losing or compromising some of the things you love about your neighborhood, like your local pool or your rec center, or your school might close, or the coffee shop that you love might not have enough patrons to sustain it.
This is why, even though you look at the map of Canada, that we have more than enough room and cheap land to expand outwards, we should resist from doing so. The cost of urban sprawl is one that we can no longer afford. Instead of creating sustainable, livable communities, urban sprawl has resulted in a car-dependent environments that are both costly to maintain and harmful for the environment, and also terrible for our well-being. These neighborhoods do not encourage neighbors to meet naturally. Instead of people encounter each other from each other's driveways or they're doing yard work. Rather than being exposed to different ideas and cultures and people over time, residents are separated by space that could be otherwise used to facilitate connection. While community and connection can still be made, it's far more difficult to initiate or maintain. Where exactly are you supposed to bump into your neighbor or meet a friend? Many people are now starting to realize this and are demanding that these new spaces actually fit their needs. I lived in a suburb for many years growing up, and I experienced many of these issues firsthand. I moved from the UK. I remember the excitement of having a big backyard to run in, but honestly, that kind of wore off over time. The suburbs were mostly an empty place unless you were going somewhere. Being so far from so many different things, like soccer practice and church and shopping, meant some days you could spend 3-4 hours just driving from A to B. If the car was in a shop for some reason, forget it. You were just isolated. But realistically, we didn't have any other choice. I want to make myself clear here. My issue is not that suburbs are an option. My issue is that suburbs are the only option if you want anything outside of a high-rise condo. The single detached homes and zoning policies established post-World War II were created pre-climate crisis and pre-loneliness epidemic. These zoning rules made sense at the time, but people's preferences have changed over the decades. Unfortunately, rules made over 60 years ago have made it difficult for the housing market to adapt to these new preferences. So why haven't we changed the zoning rules for so long? People don't like change. It's human nature. Even if the change is in the best interest, people tend to resist it. There is a reason behind this. This resistance is driven by a mix of psychological tendencies. The sunk cost fallacy. This is a tendency to continue investing in a decision because of the time, effort, or money that's already been invested, even though it's not a good decision. Status quo bias. The preference to keep things the same rather than to change, even though it may lead to better outcomes. This bias stems from the idea that we've always done it this way. Loss aversion. This tendency to prefer losses rather than acquiring equivalent gains. In other words, the pain of losing is psychologically more powerful than the pleasure of gaining. These psychological phenomena make it difficult to embrace any type of change. So when it comes to people's neighborhoods and homes, it's understandable to see why people aren't too excited to see any change at all. There's a term for people who resist change in their neighborhoods, and their name is NIMBYs. Not in my backyard. While this term is often used pejoratively, that's not my intention here. My goal is to understand their perspective. NIMBYs are homeowners that are opposed to substantial changes in their neighborhoods because they value the current character and dynamics of their community. Acknowledging their concerns is important as we explore the need for balanced and sustainable urban development. People are comfortable with what they know, and the idea of new developments can be intimidating. However, if we do not adapt, we risk making our cities unsustainable and unlivable for future generations. I truly believe that most people meant well, but the system was broken. It was against people's immediate interest to have new buildings in their neighborhood. There are several legitimate concerns with densification: strain on infrastructure, parking, neighborhood character, overcrowding, affordability. These are all important factors to consider when planning to densify an area. However, there are ways to mitigate these problems while promoting densification. Let's address them one by one. Infrastructure strain. Critics argue that our current infrastructure cannot handle increased density and will lead to service breakdowns. However, well-planned densification includes infrastructure upgrades. These upgrades are more economically feasible with a denser concentration of taxpayers who can better support the infrastructure that they use. When I speak with Eric, he actually raised a very good point.
So to build new infrastructure to these new, like brand new greenfield development areas is really expensive and costly, and complicated. And so basically, the roads get bigger, the pipes get bigger, other things being equal, right? And the cost goes up. And so we have some older neighborhoods where the population used to be larger than it is. During, like, for example, there's neighborhoods right around the downtown core that were developed in the 40s, or late 40s into the 60s. The population was a lot higher during the baby boom. When their mom and dad and 4 or 5 kids in the houses, and now there's the population is less, and so the infrastructure was built to support more people than there are in some cases, right? And obviously there still needs to be some infrastructure upgrades, but overall it's just a smarter choice because you're making use of existing infrastructure to house the population that's growing today and tomorrow.
People left the neighborhoods inside the city to go to the suburbs. So oftentimes, those neighborhoods that they left are now being densified once again. So back in the past, the infrastructure was already built out to accommodate a lot more people and had actually been underutilized for the most part because the population went down. But infrastructure strain alone isn't something that cannot be overcome. And in my opinion, isn't a good excuse to not consider densification at all. Like, obviously, you would have to build a brand new infrastructure regardless if you're building in a brand new suburb for the most part anyways. Parking. Parking is a valid concern, as densification could lead to parking shortages. However, the goal of densification is to increase transportation options by reducing car dependency, improving public transit, expanding cycling infrastructure, and creating pedestrian-friendly areas. By making it easier and more convenient to use alternatives to cars, we can reduce the overall need for parking. You can still park your car on private property, such as your driveway. There will just be less public space for privately owned vehicles, and more of that space will be dedicated to the public use. Neighborhood character. While it's true that densification will bring changes, it's possible to preserve the unique character of neighborhoods through thoughtful design and community involvement. However, the need for homes is more important than preserving something as nebulous as neighborhood character. Cities should look beautiful, but they also need to be functional. With careful planning, we can achieve both an aesthetic and visual appeal, as well as practicality. Overcrowding. The fear of overcrowding is subjective. What feels like overcrowding to me may not feel like overcrowding to you. Generally, much of the overcrowding comes from cars because they take up so much space while moving so little people. Reducing space for vehicles would leave more space for people. There are ways to build denser that do not feel overcrowded but can accommodate more people. Affordability. Finally, let's talk about affordability. Many have complained about the high price tags of these skinny homes. It's understandable that we need affordable housing, and seeing new, more expensive homes with less space can be frustrating. However, these high prices reflect the current restricted housing supply. By increasing the number of units on the property, we are increasing the supply, which will in turn reduce prices in the long run. More people are buying these homes compared to single detached homes, means fewer people with high purchasing power competing with those who can only afford less expensive housing. This makes housing more affordable overall. Restricting densification will only make this problem worse. These concerns are important and ensure that we approach densification the right way. However, we must weigh them against the significant consequences of urban sprawl we have previously mentioned. Yes, you may not be able to park in the exact same parking spot, but that inconvenience is minor compared to the destruction of precious wetlands to make room for more families. I understand why there is so much sensitivity around people's neighborhoods, especially since their retirements are often tied up in their homes. Any threat to house prices can be hard to stomach, but every decision involves trade-offs. With skyrocketing house prices, it is time to prioritize those who need homes over those who have already have them and benefited from the rising prices. I'm sure you guys remember how difficult it was for you guys to get your first house. Statistically, it has become harder than ever to become a homeowner. Homeowners more than anyone should understand that affordable housing is an absolute necessity. The only sustainable way to achieve this, both environmentally and economically, is by making the most of the land we have by adding more density to our neighborhoods. The issue is that we have a system in which people's personal interests do not align with the greater good. And that greater good is affordable housing for everyone. We are currently facing a housing crisis, and ensuring people have affordable homes in livable communities is paramount. The old zoning rules contributed to this crisis, which is why they needed to be changed from the ground up. Edmonton is addressing this with a new bylaw. This is Kim Petrin, the development manager with the city of Edmonton. She loves her job. She loves Edmonton. So it was great to hear that somebody like this was tasked with helping create the new zoning bylaw.
But a number of years ago, we actually eliminated exclusive single detached residential only zone. So Edmonton already did that. We did other changes incrementally over time in terms of allowing lot splitting, so taking a 50-foot lot and splitting it in half. We then allowed secondary suites and garage suites. And I would say the small scale residential zone, which is the land, most of Edmonton is zoned small scale residential, was the next turn of the dial of allowing diversity of housing type, really focused on how big the box is, not what kind of box it is. So you still have the same height, you have setbacks, landscape requirements, trees, all those sorts of things. But what goes inside the box could be different things like row housing, single detached housing, multi-unit housing, cluster housing. But it just allows for flexibility and innovation for the market to respond to the demand of where people want to live. We've also done a lot of work around how to get a permit. And the Canadian Home Builder Association in 2022 did a study across 21 cities across America, and Edmonton's number one in terms of development processes, timelines, and development charges. And so, from an investor and attraction perspective, that's good.
As previously mentioned, if you want to develop anything other than a single detached home, the process was lengthy and often faced high chances of failure due to NIMBY opposition. This meant duplexes, triplexes, or smaller building units got rarely built. However, the new zoning laws allow for these type of developments, giving developers the flexibility to create homes that people actually want. The zoning bylaw allows for density to scale based on the proximity to main traffic corridors or central spots. This means more people can live near places they want to go, such as barbershops, grocery stores, and workplaces. Eric actually explains this very well, so I'm going to let the 20-year veteran of planning talk about this, and then I'll come right back.
When planners look at the city, we're often looking down at maps, like kind of looking down on high at these maps of the city, and like certain streets pop out in terms of having sort of important focus, and maybe it's because they've got some commercial development along them, maybe it's because they've got really great transit, maybe it's because of where exactly they're leading to. And so over time, the city of Edmonton has developed this map of nodes and corridors. So a node is just like a central destination point where there's a lot of activity going on, and a corridor is a main route from one node to another, ideally, right? And so when you look at the city plan, which is our municipal development plan, there's a map called nodes and corridors, and it's basically these are just important routes where things are happening, or areas where things are happening, and roads that connect them also, and they also tend to be places where the city is a little bit more walkable than other parts of the city, or where we should be more walkable, right? So there are areas where we can see development going in and making the area more successful, more vital, the businesses more vibrant, and So when the city, when planners talk about nodes and corridors, we're really thinking about like good places to intensify the city, the existing parts of the city core.
These bylaw also permits businesses to be incorporated into local neighborhoods, reducing transit times. This does not mean that there'll be refineries next door, but businesses like daycares, vet clinics, and coffee shops can now be closer to their customers. Does this mean there'll be lots of skyscrapers next to single detached homes? No, there are still limits on how tall buildings can be and how much land they can occupy. A lot of people's issues with densification come up because the only idea of dense living would be skyscrapers, which makes a lot of sense if you think about it, because skyscrapers were the only type of dense living allowed, because there was so few areas in the city to build denser living that those areas had to overcompensate for the lack of density in the whole city. By allowing a little bit of density across the whole city, that reduces the need for taller skyscrapers. This kind of building is uncommon in Edmonton and in most cities this side of the globe. When people think density, they often picture cities like Hong Kong or Tokyo. However, cities like Montreal show that dense neighborhoods do not have to feel overcrowded. I get it, I mention Montreal a lot, and every urban planner gushes about Montreal, but it is arguably the best city in North America when it comes to the way that they handle densification. In Montreal, 3 to 4 story buildings with private entrances and balconies are common. This type of density maintains the neighborhood feel and is known as the missing middle. The missing middle refers to a range of multi-unit or clustered housing types that are comparable in scale with single-family homes, providing a middle ground between the high-rise apartment buildings of downtowns and single detached houses. This includes duplexes, triplexes, fourplexes, townhomes, and courtyard apartments. Neighborhoods like this bring density in a way that is comfortable for most people. Let's compare 2 areas, one in Edmonton and one in Montreal. A typical Edmonton neighborhood full of single detached homes has a population density of 3,410.1 people per square kilometer. A similar neighborhood in Montreal has a population density of 14,362.0 people per square kilometer. Despite the high density, the Montreal neighborhood does not feel overcrowded. Single detached homes can still fit into such neighborhoods just fine, but the overall land area is used much more efficiently. Oh, and I also forgot to mention that the neighborhood in Montreal is also far smaller than the neighborhood in Edmonton, and still it carries so much more people. Multi-generational living is something the West can learn from other parts of the world. In many cultures, multiple generations live under one roof, providing support and maintaining strong family ties. So these kind of housing options can include features that support multi-generational living, like separate living spaces within the same building, ensuring privacy while still fostering those family connections. This approach offers numerous benefits, especially when integrated into a missing middle housing strategy. The really cool thing about missing middle housing is that it does help with affordability by offering a range of housing options that cater to different income levels. This allows people to go through all phases of life within their neighborhood, if they choose to, enabling them to age in place without moving away from the community they call home. Aging in place becomes a realistic option with these housing types. Older adults can stay in their communities close to friends and family, and can continue to enjoy the amenities and social networks that they have built over the years. This reduces the emotional and financial stress associated with moving to a new area or downsizing to a smaller home. I think a perfect creative example of that would be garden suites. Garden suites are little homes built typically in people's backyards, hence why they're called garden suites, that accommodate maybe 1 to 2 people. These garden suites can be built in people's current gardens or on back alleys. That's why they also may be called laneway homes. And these homes are often beautiful pieces of architecture because people can spend a little bit more money due to the floor space of the home being much, much smaller. These homes can accommodate everything a regular house can, and oftentimes people use it for aging in place. Older people would, maybe grandparents will move into the garden suite in the backyard while their grandchildren and their children live in the main house at the front. To accommodate different housing types, you accommodate the flexibility for the housing market to accommodate to people's actual needs, and for the housing market to shift and move and provide accommodations for people in different stages of their lives. Moreover, multi-generational living supports the concept of shared responsibility. Younger family members can assist with chores and care for elderly relatives, while seniors can provide childcare and pass down cultural and family traditions. This creates a more resilient and supportive community fabric. Building this way allows us to build communities where everyone from children to seniors can live and thrive together. By embracing the missing middle and promoting multi-generational living, we can create neighborhoods that are not just more affordable and sustainable, but also richer in social connections and support systems. It's time to rethink how we design our urban spaces to accommodate the needs of all generations, ensuring that everyone has a place to call home.
often when we're talking about density in housing, we're talking about units, and it's like, no, we need to talk about families and neighbors, and tell those stories.